Welcome to episode 6 of Behind the Bills. I'm Iván Carrillo. Coming up, ACSA was front and center at the state capitol for a hearing on the local control funding formula. We'll bring you the latest and let you know where things stand. Plus, we're about a week away from Election Day. Buckle your seatbelts as political data expert Paul Mitchell sits down with me for a fascinating conversation. He'll share everything you need to know about the latest polling data leading up to November 5th. Let's jump right in. Just over a week ago on October 17th, the State Assembly had a hearing focused on the local control funding formula. This was a joint hearing between the Assembly Education Committee and the Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 3 on Education Finance. The hearing was focused on the fiscal design of the LCFF. I'm proud to share that ACSA was called to give expert testimony on the LCFF and to provide our perspective to the legislators. Our executive director, Dr. Edgar Sassueta, took center stage at the hearing. He emphasized a few really key points. First, that the LCFF has been a catalyst for really important change. The emphasis on our state's most vulnerable students, as well as the emphasis on local control, that's paved the way for some really meaningful student gains. Secondly, is that the state needs to increase base grants, that this is critical to providing schools with the resources they need to meet the needs of their students, that the cost of doing business has gone up exponentially, that base grants are insufficient to meet schools' core functions, and not to mention that there's been a significant rise in fixed costs that schools have to deal with. It's clear that there's going to be continued focus on the local control funding formula, and we are going to continue to stay on state officials to make sure that they're investing in public education in a meaningful way. And this means increasing base grants so we can best serve students and so we can close long-standing equity gaps. Before we get to our conversation with Paul, I want to call your attention to a really important deadline related to the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. The state recently made changes and now requires that all LEAs submit an expenditure report for funds from the last 2 fiscal years. The deadline for this report is October 31st. And it's critical that you meet this deadline because if it's missed, your LEA will have to forfeit its entire ELOP allocation amount. We wanted to bring this to your attention so your district doesn't lose out on any money. The report must be submitted through the CDE website, but if you're in need of any additional information, go to the ACSA Resource Hub for all the details. Political data expert Paul Mitchell joining me on Behind the Bills. Paul, thank you for being here.
Of course.
There's been a whole host of election reforms that California has enacted over the last decade. Same-day voter registration,
it's
expanding.
An amazing amount of reforms. And when I think about election reforms, I think about it kind of in a spectrum. You know, how do voters get registered? How do they stay registered? How do they get their ballot? How do they return their ballot? How does their ballot get processed? And then you can add on top of that, what kind of election systems are they voting in, like a top 2 election system or a districted election system versus an at-large election system, even ranked choice voting and all of that. And California across the board has done more than any other state to make it easier to vote, to make registrations. Nowadays, if you're registered to vote and you move, your registration will automatically get updated. When we recently moved, my wife and myself and my dad, when we moved, I was like, nobody re-register. Just because I wanted to see the system work. And literally like 3 months later, we all got little postcards saying, we've noticed you moved and we re-registered you. And so the quality of the voter file data, the ease with which people are getting their ballots in the mail all the time for all their elections, the multiple pathways people have to return ballots, either in drop boxes or mail or in person, and you know, the kind of from soup to nuts, the system has been improved and there's been a ton of reforms. And we're seeing the impact of those in our elections, although we have seen some data to suggest that it's not doing everything we want it to do. We still have an election system where young people and renters and Latinos in particular among minority groups are underrepresented in people who actually end up casting ballots. And so that means that our elections and who we elect and what ballot measures we pass are reflective not of like the totality of California's registered voters. It's, the sometimes 60%, sometimes 50%, sometimes 75% of people that actually turn out.
Yeah, I've heard you speak to that, where in raw numbers, there's certainly significant increases in terms of voter registration and voter turnout. And if you're looking at that, it can be really misleading in terms of celebrating the progress because there's still lack of representation in terms of the overall electorate.
It's funny because we can't measure the impact of a lot of these reforms just looking at one number. Because you could say that, this coming election cycle, it'll probably be 75, 78% turnout. And people say, well, that's lower than 2020. And we've had a turnout that rate for a long time. But it's 75 to 78% of turnout among 22 million voters. And we were to look before the reforms happened, we had maybe 17 or 15 or 14 million voters. And so the quantity of ballots being cast in this election is enormous. So you could say just on turnout, how we measure it can be misleading. Also, even when you say, hey, it's 78% turnout, that doesn't mean that it's 78% of rural Central California. It might be 60%. That doesn't mean it's 70% of younger Latino renters. It might be 50%. Maybe younger Latino renters are only 70% of them are registered, whereas statewide, we're about 85% of the population's registered. So there are still inequities within the system. It's just that the state has done everything that any other state has ever done and more to try to make the system easier and make it more efficient.
How have campaigns adapted how they're doing work? Because I imagine, or correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, are they just leaving those Latino renters, for example, just alone and just not spending a lot of resources and time trying to turn them out? Or is there are you seeing that given the data and given the reforms that there's very different campaigning nowadays in terms of how folks are going about trying to turn people out on election day?
Yeah, so every election cycle, consultants and campaigns are trying things to win, right? And the things they're trying are oftentimes the most cost-effective things. And they'll think, well, if a mailer costs $1 and I want to send it and make sure somebody reads it, then I better send it to like a suburban homeowner first because we know that that's going to be the most bang for the buck. And the thought of like sending that mailer for $1 to like somebody who's targeted on the voter file is looking like they're very unlikely to vote is a less efficient expenditure. And so there is some concern, honestly, that the campaigns knowing everybody's vote behavior and all this modeling and data around likelihood to vote actually creates a self-perpetuating cycle where people who are less likely to vote get less voter communication and therefore are even more less likely to vote. Now, the flip can be true. If you're that younger Latino voter, you might get on the list of local community-based organizations who have grants from foundations to try to increase turnout. You might get on the lists of campaigns who feel like if they don't get this Latino turnout going, that they're not going to win, so they do a lot more text messaging, digital ads, phoning and knocking and communication to those folks to try to elevate their turnout. Turning somebody out in that circumstance is a lot easier now since they're staying registered largely, and they are getting a ballot. And so it's less, of a challenge to get them to actually vote than it might have been in the old days where you were like, okay, this actual Tuesday, where are you going to be? Do this one thing on this one day in the middle of November, We
were in the middle of a pandemic last presidential election. Yeah. I'm just curious what expectations you have in terms of what we're going to see with this election versus the unique experience that we were all living through back in 2020.
Yeah, literally wrote an article in the Sacramento Bee today. So it just ran saying stop using 2020 as your crystal ball. And the reason is that the 2020 election was such a unique election cycle. My personal experience was that we were in lockdown and we were getting the mail every day because I just needed to get out of the house for 2 minutes, And when my wife and I got our ballots, we're like, hey, let's take the dogs and let's walk to the library and use the drop box. And it was like getting out of the house. It was like an excuse to do something in those dreary kind of months of COVID. And you saw a ton of early voting. In fact, in the first 10 days of early voting in California, we had around 2.5 million ballots cast, and we had literally 2 million more ballots cast by 10 days out in 2020. We're at 4.5 million ballots in 2020 because not only were people in lockdown and getting the mail every day, but there was also a lot of messaging where Republicans were being told, don't trust vote by mail. And Democrats were being told, if you don't mail your ballot, then it's not going to get there on time because, the Postmaster General is slowing down mail. And you literally have people on Twitter going I ordered something on Etsy 3 months ago. It's still not here. So I can't trust the mail system unless I mail my ballot immediately. Kind of goofy conspiracy stuff, but it did cause a lot more people to mail their ballots early. And so it's a bad comparison to say, well, what happened in 2020 and what's happening now?
Can we compare to 2016 or glean anything
So that's
from
the other
prior
thing.
elections?
You could say, oh, let's compare to 2016. But remember, 2016, not everybody was getting mailed a ballot in California. So it itself isn't a good metric either. And you could say, okay, well, where's an election where we weren't COVID and everybody got mailed a ballot? 2022. Or the gubernatorial recall. Again, gubernatorial recall was weird. The Democrats were being told mail early, just vote on the first question, skip the second question. In the 2022 gubernatorial election cycle, it was super low turnout. So we don't have a great, comp. It's kind of like in real estate, If this election is like the only single family home on, in within 5 blocks and all the other houses are apartment buildings and condos, you just don't have a good comp. And that's what we have here is an election that is kind of a standalone. We can look at the early vote that's coming in now at its face value and say, okay, Republicans are overperforming on some of the early voting. Independents are underperforming. Half the ballots that have come in so far are from seniors. Only 10% of the ballots that have come in so far are from age 18 to 34. It's actually more 18 to 34-year-olds than seniors. But seniors are half the ballots and 18 to 34 are 10% of the ballots. Latinos are 28% of the voters and they're only 16% of the ballots that have come in. So we can see these trends, but it's not just as simple as saying, let's look at 2020. In fact, that's true for so much of what we see out there in the world where we see, oh, the Nate Silver model says this and, 538 says that and some expert on CNN or Fox News says this. They're gleaning from a sample of maybe the last 10 elections and trying to make some kind of smart assumption. But the reality is that, if I did a poll and I came into your office and said, I've got this great poll, here's the polling results. And you said, how many people did you survey? And I said, 10. You say, well, that's not a real poll, Paul. What are you doing? But that's what's happening with a lot of election analysis is that we don't have recent similar elections. We don't have enough of them to make really, really bulletproof decisions.
So speaking of polls, there's been so much, right, just made of the reliability of polling.
Yeah.
What has changed, in this election cycle as it relates to polling that might give greater confidence or maybe lack thereof in terms of the reliability?
Well, I'll tell you, the polling industry has gone through a lot in the last 10, 15 years. When I first started working at Political Data, we provide polling samples to most of the internal pollsters and a lot of the university pollsters. And somebody would say, okay, I'm going to do a poll of 400 people. And we'd be like, great. And we would send them 50 to 70 voters for every one person they're trying to get in their poll, right? And that would be enough for them to get through their poll easily. They wouldn't have to come back to us for more data. They'd be like, okay, and they get through their poll. I'm sending 250 people for every one person that they need in a poll nowadays. And not only am I sending 250 people, but I'm sending not just the landline numbers, because very few people have landlines, but also the cell phone numbers, and they're calling people on their cell phones. They're also texting people on cell phones to have them take a survey that's like a version of the survey that's online, and then sending emails of voters. So you have multi-method polling that is so different than what polling was, back in the 70s and 80s. And that creates challenges because they'll say, certain people you can get on a cell phone, certain people respond to a text, certain people won't respond to a poll at all. And then there's one thing that's happening in this election there's this thing called herding, where oftentimes pollsters do herding when they release their results. Like if you have a poll that says that Donald Trump's winning by 14 points in Florida, most pollsters are going to be like, let's not release that. But New York Times did just release a poll like that, and they were kind of celebrated in the nerd world for releasing a big outlier poll that's different than everybody else's. The herding also happens in techniques. And right now there's a lot of pollsters that are doing this thing where they're saying in a poll, hey, who did you vote for in the last election? And they'll say, I voted for Trump or I voted for Biden. And at the end of their poll, they make sure that if they're polling in Pennsylvania and Biden won by 1 point, they want to balance their poll, weight it so that the final sample they have is voters saying they voted for Biden by 1 point. So that methodology has problems. And the big problem is that people aren't honest about that. If I asked you in a poll, did you floss your teeth this morning? Everybody's going to say yes, because it's a socially desirable answer. And if you're somebody who voted for Biden last cycle, but now you've got Trump flags all over your house, and I ask you who did you vote for the last election, you say, I voted for Trump. Or sometimes it's just benign, like you kind of forget. Like if you asked me, who did I root for in the last Super Bowl, I'd probably think like who won the Super Bowl and then tell you that's who I voted for or who I rooted for, because it's just the way your mind works. So there's a lot of things that pollsters are doing. They have to do, there's challenges in getting surveys done. There's challenges in weighting polls. The polls in 2022 were actually really good. The polls in 2020 were off, but God, it was a weird election. Where these polls are going to be off this election cycle, I don't know, but my only one prediction is they're probably all going to be off kind of in the same direction. So we're going to go into election cycle. If we're in this election cycle like we are right now, and Kamala Harris is up by an average of 1 point, which probably puts her in an electoral disadvantage, good than the Electoral College, I would guess that she either gets 300 electoral votes or Trump gets 300 electoral votes. But it's not going to be that close on election day. There's going to be a movement one way or the other, and we'll unpack later what in the polling caused a shift, and it'll probably be consistent among all states.
What's most interesting to you about what's on our state ballot in terms of national, the federal election aside here? Yeah, we're obviously a deeply blue state, at least when you look at our legislative makeup. You see who our state constitutional officers have been. But certainly, better than me that you unpack that a little bit. There are certainly red pockets. There are certainly very purple areas of our state. So just what are you finding most interesting about our state level races?
Well, I think first off, control of the U.S. House is probably going to come down to California. And there are a family of races, 2 in Orange County, the old Katie Porter seat and the Michelle Steele seat. 1 in northern L.A. County, Mike Garcia's seat. Then moving further north, the Valadeo congressional seat in the Central Valley around Bakersfield, and then even further north, John DeWardy's the incumbent first-term member in the 13th, and that's Adam Gray running against DeWardy. Those are the critical kind of first-tier potential swing seats. There's 2 others. The 41st, which is Ken Calvert's district, where Rollins is running for the second time in that race, and he's got a lot of money, and a lot of Democrats are excited about that. And then Jessica Morse up here in the Placer County, Sacramento Valley area, all the way down the 395 to like Death Valley. That's a huge, weird district. And she's running against Kevin Kiley. You're totally right that this is a blue state, but those districts have voted more Republican than Democratic over the last, 20 years in different iterations. The redistricting that was done in the 2020 cycle made all those seats a little bit more Democratic and make them a little bit more competitive.
Is Kamala being at the top of the ticket changing how we're viewing those races too?
It sure is changing from Biden. When Biden was at the top of the ticket, Democratic enthusiasm was really deflated. And I think Republicans would have held every one of those seats and picked up the Katie Porter seat. So it would probably be Republican +1 if it was still Biden at the top of the ticket. And if in the last week here, the Kamala Harris campaign kind of implodes, and we see Donald Trump at like a 5-point national polling advantage, that probably would point to Democrats having a real hard time picking up any of these seats as well. There is a kind of a national wind that will help determine the outcome of some of those seats, along with kind of like local kind of differences. There's unique things about a number of those seats, especially like the Michelle Steele Tran race in the 45th congressional district. That has its own, ethnic politics and local political issues aside from the national stuff. But the national race momentum will probably help influence a lot of those congressional races.
I'm finding everything that you talk about and what you put out just so fascinating, so intriguing, so interesting. I'm curious, what are you finding most, or what fascinates you most about this whole world that you're operating in, when you're looking at the data, what you're seeing, or what expectations might be? What intrigues you most?
Well, there are a number of things that are interesting. One thing that's been really interesting is looking at how Republicans have started making gains in voter registration, especially among minority voters, especially among men, male Latinos, and the impact that might have in the kind of coalitions that we traditionally see in, Democrat and Republican bases. And then the opposite thing is happening too with Democrats. They're doing a lot better with, white, college-educated, suburban voters. And this political parties shift, coalitions shift over long periods of time. We might be experiencing a small shift, but it also might just be a pure Trump effect. It might be that if the election was different and we had Nikki Haley versus Joe Biden, we wouldn't be seeing any of that. That suburban college-educated voters would be voting for Nikki Haley and Latino voters would be, sticking with Democrats. I don't know. It might just be like almost a Trump effect. He's been around almost 10 years now, and the effect that he's had on transforming that entire political party in his name, and for better or worse, it's having impacts on those kind of voting coalitions, even in deep blue California. The other thing that's interesting to me is a lot of these ballot measures. Ballot measures are interesting because, like local elections, they don't have political party on them. It's very, very, very hard to get elected statewide in California as a Republican. It's kind of easy to get elected in local government as a Republican. I'm not saying it's easy, but you see a lot more elected Republicans in local office because they don't have a party label next to them. And you see a lot of voting in a Republican nature, like Prop 36. Prop 36 is a ballot measure to undo Prop 47's criminal justice reforms. And it's a tough on crime ballot measure. And voters in California are going to pass it overwhelmingly. 60-something percent, 70% among some subgroups. I think among Latinos, it was over 70% support for Prop 36. Now, if you were running a gubernatorial candidate and their message was all the things in Prop 36, but they were Republican, they would not win in California. But you run the issue as a standalone issue without the partisan labels, and it wins. Rent control is the opposite. Rent control is something that if you have a statewide candidate who's a super rent control Democrat and they're running as a Democrat, they'll probably win statewide. But you put it on the ballot without the party designation, it's probably going to lose. So part of what's interesting about these ballot measures is that it gives you a reflection of the true voter interests and beliefs once you strip away the effects of partisanship and the hurting that happens with partisanship.
We're big supporters of Proposition 2, speaking of the ballot.
Of course. I was thinking about that.
School facilities bond. What are you seeing there in terms of what's coming in already?
Well, there is new PPIC polling out, and I don't recall what the exact numbers were. I've worked on education bonds going back to when I was at the Assembly Higher Education Committee. We worked on a lot of the higher education bond stuff. And voters have been traditionally supportive of bonds. This bond, I think, is back. I don't think it passed last time, and so now they're back this time. I think with this electorate, it's going to pass. I think it would be more challenging if Biden was the nominee, believe it or not, just because if Democratic turnout was that kind of, unenthusiastic, you might have a tougher time, but I think that it's going to pass this time.
Anything in terms of just predictions for how things play out that one kind of a safe prediction maybe, but also anything that might surprise us who aren't following the data the way that you are, but wouldn't be surprising to you?
Well, it might surprise people that we're already talking about the 2026 gubernatorial election. We already had one debate. I mean, people hear that, they're like, wait, there was a debate for the gubernatorial election in 2026 already? I think that, this election for president is super up in the air. The outcome of this election is going to impact so much, but it's also going to impact California. It's going to impact the next governor's race. It's going to impact the political parties and how they reshape themselves in a additional 4 years of a Trump presidency or in a post-Trump era. You'll see those effects in the data. You'll see, as an example, if Trump gets reelected, you're going to see a huge spike in Democratic registrations. It just always happens. If Kamala Harris gets reelected, you're going to see a huge spike in Republican registrations. Almost like the best thing that could happen to the Republican Party in California could be a Kamala Harris presidency, because it would, really give them a common enemy, and a reason to organize around, and it could help them kind of rebuild. Is right now they're such a regional party instead of a statewide party. So the best thing that could happen to them almost is a Kamala Harris presidency. But I think that's the number one thing I'm looking at is, once this election's over, how this election itself will be transformative in who our electorate is and how they're thinking and voting. Turnout's going to be high, 75, 78%. I mean, a lot of the stuff nationally I don't pay as much attention to, but we could have this drag out until the weekend after the election before we actually know the results, which is going to be its own kind of torture. And if I were to have to place a bet, it would be that, there will be people contesting the outcome of this election.
I could go on for hours just talking to you about all this and continuing to unpack it. And I hope we have another opportunity here soon. But thank you so much for coming on Behind the Bills, and found this to be really interesting. I know our listeners will too.
Happy to do it.
All right, that's it for Behind the Bills. Thanks again to Paul Mitchell for joining the show. And of course, thank you to our team behind the scenes for their work. And as always, please be sure to like, review, and subscribe. For everyone here, I'm Iván Carrillo. We'll see you after the election.